Hello and welcome to The Nation. I'm NADIAH Abdul. Today, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim presented and explained the government's plans and measures to address the reciprocal tariffs imposed by the United States of America at a special parliament session in Kuala Lumpur today. Now, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim believes that Malaysia's strong economic fundamentals, supported by structural framework underlying the Madani economic framework, will enable the country to overcome global uncertainties and the future challenges. To analyse the government's plans as well as measures, we're joined today by two leaders, Datuk Dr. A.T. KUMARARAJAH, Vice President of the National Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Malaysia, NCCIM, as well as Dr. CHEE Assistant Professor of Business and Economics of University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. It's been quite a session and it's still ongoing as we speak. Yeah. Yes, definitely. Now, let's get straight into it. We know that PMX, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, has already mentioned that the US government does agree, or looks like they're going to agree, to further talks with Malaysia on this surprise reciprocal tariffs. And we are seeing that the tariffs that are imposed on the country is likely, although it's still at current early stages, likely that the US will reduce the 24% reciprocal tariffs. Now, in your opinion, what factors will influence this decision for potential reduction? Let's go to Dato' A.T. first.
So I think, right, so we're now into the fifth week of this whole tariff liberation day thing. And I think Malaysia is already one of the first few countries that turned up in Washington, and it was very rightfully led by Tunku Zafrul himself. So Zafrul probably has the depth and also the playbook that we used during COVID to kind of negotiate what needs to be done. I'm sure, because I remember watching today morning's parliament session, and Prime Minister did say, look, we are subject to NDA, so we really can't tell you what we are discussing with the American side, but we will certainly negotiate it from a strength of national interest, yes, and to make sure that we don't concede any of those really huge pain points for the Malaysian markets, but still make this happen. The fact that he has given it a bit of optimistic viewpoint that there's possibility of reduction, I think that is across the board. It's not really very unique to Malaysia, because the way America has handled it also, after the liberation announcement, there's this 90-day moratorium of sorts, and then coming back to resetting back to the 10% baseline. So we are in a fairly decent position, and I think we have got a lot of things going for us in that way that we will see through the storm, maybe a little bit battered here and there, but eventually I think we will
I like the fact that you
safely reach the port.
Battered here and there. Doctor, how likely do you think the US is going to ease or roll back some of these tariffs, and what do you think Malaysia needs to offer in return, since this is a reciprocity situation?
I'm pretty sure that the Americans would actually roll it back, because from the get-go, the tariff numbers that you actually look at, that Malaysia supposedly imposed on the US, like 47%, 6%, whatever it may be, is terribly high. So the way I see it is the Americans are actually adopting a shock tactic to sort of get people to come to the negotiation table, to actually say, look, we need to talk, and these are the things we actually think is happening, so let's negotiate. So I think one of the things that Tunku Zafrul, the trade minister, actually talked about was non-tariff trade barriers. So I think these are some of the things that Malaysia has to look at, where if you have tariffs, for instance, you can actually just bring your goods into Malaysia or into the US by paying a tax in some sense. But non-tariff trade barriers are actually more complicated in that way. They actually restrict certain things from coming in outright. So I think these are some of the things that the Americans are looking for. The other thing is sort of technology security, intellectual property. So whether things that are actually being manufactured here, made here, would actually sort of leak into the hands of the enemies of the Americans. So I think these are some of the things that we have to talk about, and it would likely make the Americans happier.
We know that, of course, Tunku Zafrul had his diplomatic engagement with the US Secretary of Commerce and the US Trade Representative, and you said that was on the back of the COVID playbook.
Yes.
What are your thoughts, both of you, on how that turned out?
That's again interesting, right? So just taking from what Dr. CHEE said, right? So we also must understand, is this actually a fight with America or the rest of the world? Yeah. Or is this a proxy fight between America and China, where the rest of the world just happens to be collateral damage, right? The fact that they cannot just simply say to one unilateral country and says, look, let's put this across the board, and let's just reset this and see how much what really falls on the table. So to a large extent, I think Malaysia has got it going from the day one. Even if you take the silver lining in this whole storm is the fact that there are a lot of industries in Malaysia which, based on any numbers that been put out from Washington, actually puts us in a pretty good standing.
Yes.
Because compared to a lot of our neighbors who are competitors to us, for example, Vietnam, to example, even Cambodia, an upcoming competitor, even China for that matter, where we are now way ahead in terms of the pricing. Yes, our pricing has gone up, say, even if you use a 24%, but our rubber gloves are much cheaper than our biggest competitor, which is China. So today, that's why you see all the prices of all our rubber shares have actually gone up. Same for furniture industry. The semiconductor industry has been given a reprieve. So in that sense, they have been given that pengecualian. So to a large extent, I think we are fairly all right. And the fact that we started this on a proactive manner and says, look, we are ready to negotiate, not only as Malaysia, but also using that ASEAN platform.
Yeah.
I think we have already, what I remember PMX saying that, look, we have already had 3 meetings of the National Geopolitical Economic Group and also an ASEAN Ministers meeting. So to a large extent, we are doing this well.
And I think there's a lot to be said about that. When the China's premier was also here in Malaysia, of course, that was
Talk about timing.
Yes, of course. Not only was it talk about timing, it was talk of the town and ASEAN.
and traffic.
Exactly. Now, Prof, when we were talking about the 47% tariff that US was imposing, or said to have refuted the US claim of Malaysia imposing the 47% tariff, in your opinion, what do you think the US claim of 47 doesn't actually reflect the situation, the actual situation? What impact could this be if a misunderstanding like this continues and persists?
Well, I think our Prime Minister and the government said that the actual numbers are closer to 5.6%. So obviously, if the tariffs are really that high, then it wouldn't be to the Americans' advantage to trade with Malaysia. But the fact is, I think, again, Trump is actually trying to adopt shock tactics to get people to sort of negotiate. I think DATUK was actually saying this very correctly. Is America really just targeting the 60 over countries in the world, or are we actually looking at China? It doesn't seem fair to just say, oh, I'm going to impose tariffs on China, but leave the rest of the world alone. That would actually look very unfair in the eyes of the World Trade Organization, right? So I think there is that for the most part. But of course, the tariffs would actually probably come down. I'm actually quite confident about that with proper negotiations. So would that actually affect anyway the Malaysian economy, especially the electronics, machinery, and semiconductor industries? It would to an extent.
Yes.
And perhaps the shock would actually be felt at the very start. But once the numbers actually start easing, I think things would actually become more positive.
And we know that Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim had already mentioned that the government is considering revising the gross domestic product, the GDP, and the forecast set for budget 2025 after gaining a little bit more clarity on where this is going to head, right? So what do you think some of the key economic factors would be that would influence this revision? Dato'?
That's the thing, right? So from the early onset itself, the calculation coming out from Bank Negara, from our economist, everything simply said, look, a worst case scenario, our GDP will be set back by about 0.5 percentage point to about 1.2 at the worst, right? And the scale back in terms of our numbers is about $60 billion. That's the worst case scenario. $60 billion, where because we are only about 12% of our exports goes to America. So even if prices increase, demand goes down, exports goes down, in terms of a hit of a GDP, 0.5 percentage point to 1.2, $60 billion down. But I think this is something that we can manage simply because we have already diversified our markets, because we are not only dependent on the market. And somehow, if you really go granular into these details, for example, large portions of this are exempted. So if this number was calculated on the fact that including the semiconductor industry, so that is an exemption to the semiconductor industry. But again, it is only to the final product. But what about the discussions that actually happened in Parliament today in terms of, look, it is not only the end product which needs to be exempted. That whole supply chain, the SMEs and the micro businesses that surround this ecosystem, they don't get that exemptions. So even though the final product produced by company X is exempted, but the supply chain is not exempted. So in that way, there is still that negative side to it. but to a large extent, I think it can be contained. They're already looking at market diversification. They're looking at, the ASEAN GCC coming up end of this month, being one of the markets where we're trying to diversify the market, because there is also a downside, the fact that, look, if China really cannot send anything across to the Atlantic to America, is this going to be a dumping ground? Is us, not only Malaysia, Southeast Asia itself, is it going to be a dumping ground for cheaper products? And that's again something that we must contain. So the negotiations with America alone does not stop in terms of how we are going to navigate this. To a large extent, there's so many factors that play, there's so many moving parts to this whole story. But I think for now, government, especially with today's parliament session, I think it signals to the world and also to the domestic market that we are on top of it. I think that way Sri Anwar has done a very good job.
And I think it's a sort of a clarity in communication during crisis. Dr. CHEE, when we were talking about earlier on how this is really going to be affecting the general Malaysian, and Dr. A.T. had mentioned about the fact that the SMEs and those midstream before the final products are not exactly exempted. So in simple terms, what does this actually mean for the everyday Malaysian? Majority of us will be SMEs or micro-entrepreneurs. Thoughts?
I think there are two parts to this. There's the actual economic impact that would actually occur when there are tariffs, and there's also business sentiments, because the market and the economy, the stock market, for instance, doesn't just operate on fundamentals. There is basically shock from news or shock by announcements and stuff like that. So I would say that at the very start, if negotiations are actually taking place well, this would actually be very positive for business sentiment. So at the very least, even if the SMEs and the micro businesses have to weather the tariff storm at the very start, it would actually give them some confidence that things would actually become better in the future. So I would say at the very start, you're probably looking at turbulences that we have to address somehow with good policies, with initiatives and help and support from the government. But eventually, I think things would actually calm down. And when fundamentals actually look strong, I think things will actually be back on track again.
And if we were to be looking at what the Prime Minister had announced, he did announce that there is going to be a 1 billion ringgit increase in the guarantee allocation for the SJPP, which stands for Syarikat Jaminan Pembiayaan Perniagaan Berhad for SMEs by the affected companies by the US tariff. Now, how do you think this additional funding is really going to be helping the SMEs navigate these challenges, Dato'?
I think this is again one of those announcements. Like for a while listening to it, I thought this is like a budget speech.
Yes.
Right. So I was like, wow, where is he starting with? But I think he's again being very proactive and saying, look, we are ready. We're ready to intervene if the markets are going to be disrupted, if the businesses are going to be disrupted. I was there in the early days on the first week of this tariffs coming out and speaking to Tengku Zafrul in one of the meetings that he had with the chambers. And I think they were very, very clear. Even we also asked the same thing. Look, it cannot be a blanket. So first the town hall session, right? So a lot of companies caught up to the mic and said, look, this is not the time to rationalize subsidies.
Yes.
Let's not pull back on RON 95. Let's not pull back on the taxes. And, this is not the time to do all these things. So I think the answer from the government, to which I, to a large extent, subscribe to, is let's not use the tariff alone trying to sort out everybody's problem. Right? So let's look at the tariffs per se and see who does it really affect. Who in MUA, for example, which is the epicenter of where the furniture industry is, which companies, granular data, which companies are affected, who is in your supply chain, who is affected, and how much are they affected by. And I think all the help, including this $1 billion which has been announced by SJPP, and I think he also mentioned another half a billion somewhere else. It just didn't mention the entity. All this help, whether it is monetary or otherwise, should go to those companies affected.
So it's
alone.
targeted
It
approach.
should not be a blanket subsidy across the board, right? Like you asked a question, is the man on the street going to be affected now? No, there is a lag. And I think by the time it comes to this, we would have already managed the situation pretty well. So to me, all those things that PMX said today morning in Parliament in terms of extending benefits and subsidies and support and everything should go towards the companies that are specifically targeted.
And, Dr. CHEE, when we were talking about sentiments, you mentioned sentiments earlier, right? When we're talking about the reciprocal tariffs and the negative impact on global supply chain, it's also going to be impacting ASEAN. I'm going to be highlighting some of the tariffs that are going to be given to all these different countries, our neighboring countries. How do you think some of these disruptions can actually maybe affect the way Malaysia positions itself in ASEAN and its relationship with all of the other countries as well?
The disruption of the tariffs on these countries? Well, there's definitely a lot of intra-trade that's actually taking place within the ASEAN region. So I would say that with all these tariffs that's actually going on, this would actually cause some sort of economic reform that's actually going on across, I think, regions, if not the world. I mean, I was actually, because I do a lot of work on China, and so one of the things that China is actually experiencing right now is that they're emphasizing a lot of domestic consumption. This is not something they've done before, but they have to, because if the external economic environment is somewhat hostile, then it's actually pretty smart to actually, or actually necessary, to look inwards and see what you can actually do. So within the ASEAN itself, I think we have to look inwards to see, can we actually integrate our trade better? Can we actually cooperate better? And can we actually do more businesses with like the GCC, with Latin America, with Africa? I think it's not just our region that needs to sort of look at ourselves. We need to look at it from a global standpoint to hedge against an unpredictable American government.
Definitely, and I think we're seeing on the back of blanket tariffs across the region, albeit in different percentages, right? We know that 46 on Vietnam, 49 on Cambodia, 36 in Thailand, even 10 in Singapore. So, as you mentioned earlier, this looks like collateral damage for a larger strategy, but is this possibly also a strategy to deliberately fragment ASEAN?
So I really don't think so, right? So again, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think this is a America-ASEAN issue. This is America-China, full stop, right? Everything else is just a footnote on this account. But the fact that now even ASEAN, while we have shown stewardship in terms of arguing this as an ASEAN perspective, but can we really argue this, say, for example, Singapore, which is very largely integrated into the system, as opposed to us, for say in the second tier, where our GDP, our trade is actually 1.5 times our GDP, which means we are hyper exposed to the international markets, or to Cambodia and Laos, which is very much lower in the value chain but having higher tariffs. So we cannot go to America and argue this as an ASEAN story. But what we can do is integrate our strategy and say, what works for you may not work for me, but let's work it out with them together. And I think all countries have reached out to America by some manner or the other, and I think some successfully, some not so successfully. I think some have received a slap on the wrist, but I think everybody is doing their best. To a large extent, what America is doing is again unpredictable. 90-day moratorium suddenly, and then now it's just like discussions every day happening, with changes in government happening every day. Like, Singapore overnight, Australia just finished it, and Canada just finished it a week ago. So a lot of this will also play into what has happened. And if you really look at the domestic market, like what Dr. CHEE mentioned, China has got the 1.4 billion population to look at the domestic market. We, on the other hand, are already our GDP is nearly 90% run by the domestic consumption.
Yes.
So there's only that much that I can consume, right? So it's not really going to work for us. But again, it is very focused, because you look at where the industries are. It's E&E, semiconductor,
yes,
large extent of that E&E portion, palm oil and rubber. So, and furnitures, for example. Pharmaceuticals have been given an exemption, but the medical equipments are. So one of the things that I know that Tengku Zafrul has brought to Washington and says, look, you have given exemptions to pharmaceuticals, but why not you give these exemptions to medical equipment within that same domain, for example? Because we export $37 billion in terms of medical equipment, especially from Penang, but $13 billion of this 37 goes towards America. So that alone is a big concession that we can get, and I'm sure we'll get that concessions.
And we know that for a fact that although there is exemption for the pharma industry, there has been discussions by pharma itself, the pharmaceutical associations, that this tariff could potentially be temporary because there's a lot of other things that are going at play. And of course, when we're talking about agriculture, there's a long-standing fight between palm and everything else, right? You're talking about soy, etc. Now, Dato', you mentioned earlier about Malaysia being a second-tier trading country, and we trade with a lot of other countries that are first tier. So Dr. CHEE, what would it take for us to be seen as first tier? Are we actually first tier trading in the second tier category?
I mean, there are definitely a lot of things that we need to take care of. Like one of them is actually outlined in the CPTPP, the agreement. So one of the things that's different from the RCEP, which involves China, is that the CPTPP actually involves higher standards of labor, environment, and all that. So I guess in order for Malaysia to actually be seen as a first-tier trading country within the region and in the world, we need to take care of some of the concerns that the West or Western countries actually
Business
have.
And human rights, etc.
Exactly. These are the things that we need to look at. At the very least, these are things that we need to definitely examine in the near future, especially when we might actually have to try to integrate our economies more, not with the Americans necessarily, but with the European Union and other parts of the Western world. So I think when you're going into that direction, we need to address the concerns that they actually have, not just our concerns, but their concerns as well, actually moving forward. So we definitely need to deal with some of these issues going forward.
So there are quite a few terminologies that we've heard recently, which is RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the CPTPP, which stands for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is actually a mouthful.
Right.
But recently there has been discussion coming out of BAYU, which is the Bahagian Hal Ehwal Undang-Undang Jabatan Perdana Menteri, which is another acronym, with Datuk Sri Azalina talking about the National Action Plan for Business and Human Rights. So there are movements that the Madani government is doing specifically to address some of these core concerns, for example, labor rights, etc. Now, when we're talking about this shifting global tides, gentlemen, within the next few minutes that we have, I wanted to talk about multilateralism in crisis. I mean, we've seen the US pulling out of the WHO, saying that the Paris Agreement and climate change is hoax or not exactly the real deal. We've also seen issues with the World Trade Organization. Are we seeing a collapse in the multilateral system here on top of whatever that they're doing?
I think it's a hard reset.
It's a hard reset,
right?
Okay.
So the whole WTO came out of the Second World War, and 2 years later on they put together this and says American-led at that point in time. It worked very well for them. But then now, with Trump in picture, but he's already promised today morning, I was listening to news and saying that he's not going to go for the third term, simply means that everything that needs to happen during the Trump era will probably subside over the next 4 years. But is that going to be how America viewing all these international institutions, WTO, WHO, UNICEF, UN, whoever? Is that how they're going to view it? Or is it only temporary something for 4 years? So should we set sail or adjust our sails towards what's going to happen in the medium term, which is 4 years, or towards the future of the country? So again, you mentioned it just now, but I think a lot of this also got to do with that trade report that came out of America, which comes out every March, apparently end of March, which kind of puts together, if you see, I remember the page number, right? It's 257 to 260 of that 400-page report, which simply says there are 12 things we are not happy with Malaysia. A lot of that is got to do with non-tariff barriers, which is like automotive, your halal standards are holier than the Pope in that sense, right? You're far too high standards. Your standards are even higher than the
stringent
than the Middle Eastern countries, the Islamic countries there. Your automotive tariffs are very high. You don't allow our international banks to open branches as much as you allow the domestic branches. And that's why I also read that Bank Negara views a branch, even an ATM machine, is viewed as a branch. So you cannot. An international bank cannot open within 1.5 kilometers of a branch, which means an ATM machine. So those are the constraints that the Americans are upset about. But I think, to be fair to what Sri Anwar and even Zafrul mentioned, saying, look, whatever we're going to negotiate with the Americans, we will not concede national interests. Because mentioned in that 12 is also government procurement, Bumiputera rights, certain things which we will not go concede. So I think that is very frightening.
And I think that was really clear, right? I mean, he mentioned clearly that we're not going to be negotiating on these two things, definitely on the Bumiputera rights, especially the special sectors of economy. Now, hypothetically, do you think we might end up in a position where we might have to negotiate some of these things? And if so, what might that look like, Doctor?
Well, it's really hard to say. I mean, I think from a political standpoint, it wouldn't necessarily be wise for the government to actually concede certain things, but there could be some leeways onto what the foreign companies could actually do when they're actually opening branches. For instance, like what Dato was saying about the ATM machines and things that seem a little strange on paper. So I think there's certain things that we can definitely talk about, but I think the biggest issue is not even that for the Malaysians. I think for the Americans, I think the question is, are we doing things that would actually harm their national interest and economic interest? So as long as we actually have certain guarantees that whatever we're doing would not actually harm America directly, that will be okay. So again, whatever reports you actually have out of the 400 where there are like 4 pages to address the Malaysian issue, it's probably just like fireworks to basically say, you know, we have issues with you, so you have to do something about that. But that's really not the main issue. The main issue is probably China anyway, I think, for the Americans.
It's also Malaysia playing that central role in terms of what's happening in China, because transshipment, that's an issue, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people think that whatever is being shipped out of here. So I remember today morning there was a discussion was this certificate of origin, which is being given by, say, the Chambers of Commerce.
Yes.
This certificate of origin, is it actually genuine? Is it coming out from Malaysia, or is it being routed through Malaysia by Chinese companies? So that concern, it's not Trump alone. I think over the years that has been a concern, and I think that's something that we may want to address now. And maybe this is time, while this may not be the right time, but it's also a wake-up call for us to also structurally adjust a lot of these things. At the same time, when we speak about this and say Bank Negara says, look, you know, there's no risk of recession, but he is also, I think the governor has come out and said, or is it the deputy governor who said, look, you know, your wages are actually exactly what it was 30 years ago.
Yes.
You should be getting about 7,000 to 8,000 starting pay, and now you're getting what?
Currently
200,
in a deficit.
2,000? Not your pay, but
Oh, I think it's across the board. Now, we earlier already spoke about the 47% miscommunication on potential tariff versus the actual situation. Now, when we're talking about what's to come, are there any blind spots that perhaps you feel that the Madani government should perhaps take a look into? I mean, you've mentioned that we've got a two-pronged strategy. We've been really, you know, sort of being the voice of reason in ASEAN, so to speak, and a lot of the different things that we're trying to preempt. You said PMX is actually playing a proactive role rather than just merely reacting to the situation that's coming up from Washington. But are there any aha moments that we should be really thinking about? Is it diversification? Is it the look at other industries? You said looking at different trade routes. Are there any other blind spots that perhaps we can also take a look at? Doctor, you first.
Well, I think one of the main issues that the Americans actually have is whether Malaysia is actually as neutral as we actually say we are. I think for smaller countries that are developing, we definitely don't want to be seen as too partial to either one side.
Yes.
So I think if you're talking about blind spots, that's not necessarily a blind spot, but it's definitely a spot that the Americans are eyeing on.
It's a sore spot.
It's a sore spot maybe, and so we need to be very careful about that. But you're talking about diversification. Surely, if we're dependent upon the electronics industry and semiconductors, we probably need to look into other areas. So like service, for instance, you know, the Americans actually have a trade surplus with us in terms of service industry. Yeah. So what we have talked about trade deficit, the Trump is actually harping on, is really just on products, not on services, because they're actually exporting more services to us than we are to them.
Correct.
So this is one area that we can actually look at services and see whether we can actually improve upon.
Definitely, and I think when we're talking about the booming service industry and the digital economy, there's quite a few things that we can actually look at. And unfortunately, gentlemen, that's all the time that we have. I would love to have you again. This time we can see what happens post the discussion that's happening out of the parliament. But definitely we know that the tariff issue with the United States presents a significant challenge, not just Malaysia, but in every other country. And whether or not we are going to be collateral damage or not, I think remains to be seen. Malaysia is poised, ready, and clear on what it's going to do and taking proactive action to address the situation. Now, of course, efforts to safeguard national interest. We might not be able to control situations that are coming to us, but we can definitely control how our response is going to be in light of the global situation. Now, thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. And of course, Malaysia, don't forget to stay safe and be kind.